Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thank you to Haymarket Books for this space to talk about McCarthyism in academia and the Palestinian solidarity movements. It's important that we always keep an eye on what's happening in Palestine, and right now, as we're speaking, Israel has started its ground invasion in Rafah after Hamas has agreed to a ceasefire. So we are here today to talk about the resistance of the Palestinian people against their own extermination and the ways that we can have honest conversations about this that can be nuanced and with the spirit of liberation and liberation for all. And this time for genocides not happening to anybody ever again, which is the spirit of so much of we're seeing all around the world with Palestine solidarity. My name is Linda Kikivish, and I'm a popular educator and geographer. And it is my honor to call you Mohamed Abdou a friend. Mohamed, just so that I might introduce you to some folks who might not know about you and your work. Mohamed is a professor who has PhD from Queen's University in Cultural Studies and an MA in Sociology, and has taught at Cornell University, not just Cornell, but Zionist land grab Cornell, as Mohamed never lets us forget, and has also taught at the American University of Cairo, and is currently a visiting professor at Columbia University. And we're here because so much of his support for Palestine has gotten him into the limelight in ways that are very dangerous. And we need to know about this and so that we can organize for each other's defense. This is happening to faculty all over the United States, and not just the United States. We also see in Canada and Europe. And we also see this in workplaces that are not academia. There's a lot of intimidation. A lot of people support the Palestinian struggle, the Palestinian people, and feel like they are afraid to say anything because they're afraid to lose their jobs. And in Mohamed's case, Mohamed is a visiting professor who does not have that security of tenure. Tenure in American academia is supposed to be a status that one reaches where it's very difficult for you to lose your job, and it's a way to protect supposedly free speech, academic freedom. And Mohamed does not have tenure, and many professors who do not have tenure usually are protected or protect themselves because they're the most vulnerable. And for you, Mohamed, it did not matter when you see the Palestinian people resisting for their own lives. You speak out against it, you organize like so many people all over the world do. This is a struggle that you're very close to as someone from Egypt with family who's lived in Gaza, who's also Muslim, which is a shared world that Palestinians have with so many people all over the world. And it's something that your work talks a lot about in a very liberatory kind of way, which is why I find your work to be so important. I don't know Mohamed as an academic. I'm not an academic, but we're both organizers. And we actually first encountered each other over a decade ago after the uprisings in Tahrir, which Mohamed was a part of. And like many of the Tahrir revolutionaries, after the co-optation of that movement, after the destruction of that movement, sought to look elsewhere for other struggles to learn what others are doing all over the world. And one of those struggles that Mohamed became interested in was the Zapatistas, which is a struggle that I've been accompanying together with the Palestinian struggle for the last 2 decades. And so we met that way. We talk a lot about this question of a world where many worlds fit, which for me, his work is so important because when we think about worlds, we need to also recognize that religions are worlds. So how can we talk about this question of religion in the Palestinian struggle, especially because religions get co-opted so frequently to be at the service of empire that it makes it so that liberation movements have a really difficult time figuring out how to articulate with religion, with spirituality even. So I want to welcome you, Mohammed, here and to allow you space for you to share your word. Uh, we're going to talk about the statements that you made on October 11th in support of the Palestinian resistance, which were very brave and very nuanced, very rich statements that this can be an opportunity for us to delineate and at the same time allow us to better understand what we're living right now with so much of the new popular movements turning toward this politics of care and difference, where there's so many different kinds of people all over the world coming together for the struggle for Palestine, which isn't just about Palestine, it turns out. It ends up being about the world. So, Mohammed, thank you for being here. Please, adelante.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Shalom al-Chaim to our Jewish siblings. I'm deeply honored and humbled to be with you and to do this event. Kiki, you're not only a friend, but a sister, and I'm very grateful to Sean. I'm very grateful to Haymarket for hosting this event. As you know, Kiki, and this is you've heard me say this many a times. I usually like to start my any public discussion really with Musa's prayer in the Quran, right? When he was about to meet Pharaoh in the company of his brother Aaron. Allahumma shrah li sadri ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. اللهم اشرح لي صدري, O Creator, may you open thy breast. ويسر لي أمري, and make my affairs easy. واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي, and undo the knot on my tongue such that what it is that I ostensibly have to share becomes accessible to our fellow kin, siblings that are listening. It would behoove me as well, because this becomes part of the conversation, not to acknowledge where I'm speaking from, which is Linen and Ape territory. And land back acknowledgements are not just simply acknowledgements, as we know, as my indigenous elders, as our indigenous movements have taught us, but are about intent, purpose, and action. So I'm going to say this again, intent, purpose, and action. And they bear relevance given the context of my work. Of 1492, the very framing of my work, as you know, Kiki, and your work, and a minority other scholars and organizers, his views with regards to the ongoing genocide in Palestine, the ongoing genocide on Turtle Island, because the genocide here is very much ongoing. Sun Tzu had written that if you fail to recognize the scope and the nature of the enemy, you will succumb in every battle. And we need to understand that America is leading this war, and Israel is but a mere instrument. We need to understand that the context of resistance is different than an anti-colonial resistance is different than talking about liberation and decolonization. We need to understand the difference between surviving and thriving. And I'm tired of people of color settling for the scraps that the white man leaves on the dinner table. So being a little bit rhetorical, let's put let's put the dots on the letters. Why is 1492 significant? Why do I argue, ostensibly, we argue, that there is no liberation for Palestine without the liberation of Turtle Island? And that is a fact. Well, because settler colonialism is a structure, as Patrick Wolf had noted, and not an event. Now, Islam and 1492, but particularly religion and spirituality become our elephants in the room. Why? In 1492, as you and I have discussed in many occasions, Kiki, and inshallah we'll continue to do so even more, to share the knowledge that has been bequeathed Islam to us, becomes very important in its historical, material, spiritual, and symbolic significance. There are two things that happened in 1492. Muslims and Jews were cast as savages and heathens. Savage being the racial definition, heathens being the religious, by Ferdinand and Isabel in Andalusia as part of the ongoing crusade. We were murdered, we were tortured, persecuted, forcibly converted at the hand of the sword. But something else happened, which is the Colombian invasion of the Americas. And that savage heathen definition was cast upon indigenous people, Turtle Island. And, Columbus had referred to the weapons that, people had used as alfanges, which is the Spanish word that is used to describe the swords that Muslims were using, which were scimitars. But not only that, one can find a similitude in how Hernan Cortez had described, Aztec women as Moorish women. The 400 Aztec temples, he described them as Moorish mosques. He described Montezuma, the Aztec leader, as a sultan. Furthermore, the term birdach that was used to describe, has been anthropologically used to describe two-spirit people, was actually cast upon Muslims first, particularly gender non-conforming Muslims. So this becomes the crux of the issue. The new world is built in the image of the old. How can we not talk about religion and spirituality when we're talking about manifest destiny, doctrines of discovery, terra nullius, Protestant conceptualizations of property, Victorian notions of gender and sexuality and common law, and so on and so forth? So there's a religious dimension to this war. And of course, white modernity, white colonial modernity, has spawned within us as BIPOC people reactionary impulses, in the sense that in my work on Islam and anarchism, I discuss how there are two branches now that Muslims are contending with, which is liberal progressive interpretations of Islam, where here were queer narratives, and so on and so forth, that assimilate the good Muslim into the settler state, the crusading settler state here, in which Muslims hyphenate their identities as many Muslim Americans, African Americans, Black Americans, queer Americans, Asian Americans, and so on and so forth. But the only American that doesn't need to hyphenate their identity is the white American, because they seem to be the native of the land. But also, the alternative choice is conservative, reactionary Muslim responses, both in the manifestation of states and at the same time at the level of movements. Social movements, right? Anti-colonial resistance movements even, right? Including Hamas, Hezbollah, and so on and so forth. That embody elements of queerphobia, that embody elements of sexism, of hierarchies, and so on and so forth, right? And not to establish a degree of symmetry between this anti-colonial resistance and a state, a nuclear state, as Israel, with no definable borders. Nonetheless, it possesses access to tanks, to sophisticated weaponry, to F-35s, F-16s, F-15s, and so on, to aircraft carriers, and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, and by the way, these diseases of queerphobia, of sexism also exist on the left. They exist certainly on the right. Right, so they're not exceptional to these resistance movements either. So let's be honest. I mean, fascism is a mass psychology that way. It's very much ingrained in the structures that we contend with: post-colonial, settler colonial, and so on and so forth. But all this to go back then to the question of genocide, right? And I'd like to say, if you don't mind, Kiki, a few things, because I think the audience really, or our fellow siblings, need to understand there is an ongoing genocide here. And while we're scrolling through genocide on phones made from another genocide, copper and cobalt mined in the Congo, right? Everybody's using Islamophobia globally, right? It's being used against the Uyghur, it's being used against the Rohingya in the context of Myanmar, it's being used against Kashmiris and Dalits in the context of Hindutva India, and so on and so forth. And it's not that Islam is a quintessential other, it has been constructed as a quintessential other in the mind of the white man, a white man that appropriated Christianity underneath Constantine and weaponized it as an imperial mode of conquest. And no, this is not a war between Muslims and Jews as much as one that Muslims and Jews have been conscripted into, vis-a-vis these white supremacist imprints upon Islam in the form of Wahhabism and Muslim Brotherhood thought, as well as Judaism in the manifestation of Zionism. And Israel does not stand for Judaism any more than Saudi Arabia stands for Islam, or Iran stands for Islam, etc., etc. And this becomes then the question: can we conduct, can we achieve, can we establish and utilize religion as a form of revolutionary force? Because Kwame Ture had noted that you can't be revolutionary without being religious. The way that it has been constructed in the popular sort of imaginary with modernity is that religion, yes, has been used as a tool of oppression. but it's also a tool of liberation. But to bring genocide, the context of genocide here, because I don't want to say this in passing, that, oh, well, there's a genocide ongoing here with regards to indigenous people. That always gets left out. 1492 always gets left out when we start American history, in particular from 1619. From 100 million strong, indigenous people have become 2% of the total US population. And this required detailed vicious planning, legislation, forced relocation, residential schools, starvation, contaminated smallpox blankets, bounties on indigenous people's heads in a society in which cavalry troops have been replaced by police shootings, incarceration, desecration of reserve lands, foster care, lack of infrastructure services, poverty as a tool of ethnic cleansing. And so the genocide continues. It continues in the form in which indigenous people are referred to unapologetically as merciless Indian savages in the US Declaration of Independence and within settler psyches. So this is, and this is to say nothing with regards to indigenous boarding school experiences, their lived impacts to this day, 150-year-old programs of separating children from their families. That was federal policy to eradicate indigenous people and to dispossess them of their lands, because in a certain sense, as Patrick Wolf, as indigenous scholars had said, land is the precise capital. And land is a subject; she's not an object, and she has spirit, so we can't anthropomorphize land at the same time. But the U.S. had supported more than 408 boarding institutions in 37 states between 1819 and 1969, so not too long ago. 431 schools and counting, that accounted for over 500 child deaths. So there's the emotional, the physical, the sexual abuse that remains rampant too, in terms of malnutrition, overcrowding, lack of health care. Indigenous children were given English names. They had their hair cut. They were forbidden from speaking their own languages and from engaging in their cultural practices. Indigenous children were murdered. They died because of abusive experiences, and they were buried in unmarked graves. And the US paid for a large proportion of this forced assimilation very much. Insofar as treaties that were unhonored in order to cede indigenous lands. So in arrangements in which indigenous people were coerced into, indigenous people are only remembered when football teams are named after them, right? The Washington Redskins, the Chiefs, or their names are on tomahawk weapons of mass destruction, or Apache helicopters. So there is an ongoing genocide, missing indigenous children and women and girls. We're talking about over 5,000. Indigenous women are twice as likely to be raped in comparison to white women. Murder is a third leading cause of death for indigenous women, often perpetuated by non-indigenous people. Of course, we can talk about how they represent 2% of police killings. Their incarceration rate is 38% higher than the national average. Right? They were removed from their homes by state social security services agencies at a far higher rate than any other children. And of course, we have settler colonialism's foundation also on afterlife to slavery projects. Slavery is constantly being rebirthed. Stand your ground laws, police brutality, premeditated extrajudicial killings, routine stop and frisk programs, policies of broken windows, voter disenfranchisement, school to prison nexus, impoverishment, premature death, 1994 crime bills that Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders voted for, and which they refer to Black men, Black youth as super predators and thugs. So this becomes, I think, very important for the context of what it is that we're talking about. We must acknowledge either there's an American dream or it's an American nightmare, as Malcolm had called it. And we must ask, do we live in a democracy, or what is a democracy when it's laden with racialized district mapping, voter disenfranchisement and suppression, partisan gerrymandering, dark money ads, electoral college systems that peg the popular vote, that are often pegged against the popular vote, 2010 Citizens United verdicts that give special interest groups unlimited spending, bills like 5014C that permit and designate social welfare programs, organizations to engage in electoral meddling in unregulated ways, right? We're talking about 531 years of ongoing genocide here. So this is what we need to contend with. 69 cop cities that are being built, the equivalent of 2 atomic bombs that destroyed all of Gaza's schools, hospitals, universities, masajid, 247 mosques, 3 churches, 199 heritage sites. This is what we're discussing here. The interlinkage between these various different transnational struggles, these orders, these regimes, the world of the above, and the world of the below, us of the below, and the architects of animosity, the manufacturing of consent in terms of the fourth estate media, Netanyahu, the White House, presidents as Minouche Shafik of Colombia, her acquiescence during the congressional hearings with right-wing forces, but not only that, the context of settler state institutions that are extension of a larger structure and order globally. We must ask ourselves, what is then the role of building a pluriverse world, as you noted, a different world, when no Dakota pipeline protesters, land defenders are being referred to as jihadi terrorists? When we're talking about intersections between blackness and Islam, when a third to a fifth of our transatlantic slaves were Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula and west coast of Africa. What then, beyond the false choices of a multipolar supposed world? It's not liberation. So I'll stop there for now.
So much richness in that, compa. One, in hearing you speak about settler colonialism in this context, especially in the greater context of Palestine liberation, it's something that's not often discussed. And I want to shout out the work of Stephen Salaita, because this was his dissertation. And he has a really great book called Holy Land in Transit that shows these religious discourses hijacked in order to colonize land here and, of course, in Palestine. And that is something, Stephen Salaita is someone who was whose academic career was destroyed by supporting the Palestinian liberation movement. And it reminds me so much of your case, because it comes to a scholar that actually truly means it, truly seems to mean it. And in academia, you can say a lot of radical, sexy things, but when you mean it is when you become a problem. And this is what we saw Minouche Shafik, the president of Colombia, treat as so many other faculty, Catherine Franke and Joseph Massad from Columbia University in the congressional hearings. And I want to take this time to talk a little bit about the statements that you made that they quoted, but that they completely misquoted and misconstrued. So that way we can discuss them more and tease them out, because there's a lot in them that is really important for how we relate to liberation and resistance and struggle in Palestine, of course, Palestine, but also for all of our movements, for all of our struggles worldwide. And I also want to, before beginning that, just want to highlight from what you just shared that there's long been struggles, whether they're in Jewish communities, Christian communities, Muslim communities, Buddhist, any communities, struggles just of the human condition to not be pulled toward a politics of fear and toward a politics of care. And that's what we see from the liberation theologians. That's what we see from, for example, the Christian Marxists, the Christian anarchists today, who are still struggling against this type of Christianity that's used for empire. A world of 1492 built a war, a holy war, unholy war, where not just Jews and Muslims have been conscripted into, but Christians have also been conscripted into. And that is that co-optation that we talk about by fascism, by imperialists, by empire, that use religion to justify what it is that they do. And there are still so many communities, even if they may be small, and we need to intensify their strength, that are fighting for their worlds to be worlds of care, not of empire. And we see this today with Jewish liberation theologians, the Jewish students in these encampments who refuse to give in to a Zionism that has hijacked Judaism and are still struggling to maintain that social justice aspect of Judaism, that heart, that real heart. That's the case with Christians, and that's the case with many Muslims, and that is how I see your work, from that line, from that liberatory political theology strain, that line, that tradition. And so with that in mind, let's get into some of the comments that you made. And I've just pulled out a couple of things. And this is the one that I've heard you talk about a bit, and I'd love for you to take this time and like tease it out a little bit more. And this is, quote, "Yes, I'm with the Muqawama, the resistance, be it Hamas and Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad, but up to a point, given ultimate differences over our ethical political commitments, that's the difference between a strategy and tactic too." So I'd love for you to say more about what are those ultimate differences in the ethical political commitments, and how does that connect with this notion of strategy and tactics?
Thank you very much for your question, Kiki. Insofar as the difference of our commitments, and I always say this, that just because you call yourself a Muslim or Black or Jewish or whatever, right, doesn't make you a part of my ummah or community, because the ultimate conceptualization of sovereignty within Islam lies within an ummah. This notion of a pluriverse world in which Muslims, Jews, Sabians, everybody really are intertwined together vis-a-vis ethical, political, spiritual commitments that they subscribe to. You could be Muslim and Zionist, right? Now, the fact of the matter is that one of those commitments is a commitment towards, appreciating queerness, appreciating gender. Right? And I wrote my dissertation, my PhD, on Islam and queer Muslims, right? The place of queer Muslims within this broader idea of the ummah. And look, like I said before, fascism is a mass psychology. Conservative Muslims tend to shy away, or given the impact of colonialism, imperialism, and the reactionary politics that spawns, right? From issues of sexuality, from issues of gender, because of the inferiority complexes, as Fanon had described, that we internalize, because how gender and sexuality have been deployed as imperial modes of conquest, right? This is why we talk about homo nationalism, the weaponization of gender and sexuality that way, towards freeing Black and brown women elsewhere, and so on and so forth, queers elsewhere. Of course, we have Israel doing that as far as pinkwashing, and so on and so forth, right? But we have a rich legacy that is often sanitized and sterilized by conservative Muslims with regards to speaking about same-sex desires, practices. We have the poetry Rumi, Nafzawi, the Sultan sex potions, and so on and so forth. Much in terms of literature that I could sit down and talk about in a whole sort of verse, or that is subject for another conversation and discussion, right? But again, these dimensions of differences over ethical political commitments, these diseases of queerphobia, of transphobia, of sexism, of hierarchy, right, that play out, because I also am against sort of states and authoritarianism, right? And ultimately, the goal of Hamas is to establish a Palestinian state. This is why I don't believe really in a 1917 or a 1948 narrative, because it ultimately accepts the British contrived borders when Gaza was a part of Egypt. It does away with Muslim native more forms, or different, let's put it that way, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and so on and so forth, different forms of governance beyond the white man's Westphalian Sykes-Picot orders that birthed nation states and capitalism. It's not like Hamas is anti-capitalist, right? And here we need to distinguish that, Hamas has a vision of sort of the world that it seeks versus Hezbollah versus ostensibly the Islamic Jihad versus Iran. They all have different versions and their manifestations, although they may intersect and diverge. But that's what I then mean in terms of, listen, I do believe in the right towards anti-colonial resistance. I mean, it was Walter Rodney that said, by what right do we accept that the violence that the slave uses to undo their shackles is the same as the violence that is used by the master to oppress the slave, right? So people of color, when they're reacting, when they're resisting, they're engaging in reactionary politics because they're trying to survive. This is why I said there's a difference between survival and thriving. They may not have had the privilege, certainly, of learning about decolonization, of working through the intellectual body, of manifesting a liberatory politics that way, right? So they tend to reproduce the same oppressions. All we learn from oppressions are learning how to repeat it, unless, again, we're afforded the opportunity to engage, at least in Islam, with regards to ijtihad, critical reasoning, and thinking through the different worlds that we're seeking to rebirth without reproducing the same manifested colonial orders that exist. But again, this is not something that is exceptional to these. And again, I don't like the word Islamist because that's an Orientalist term. Any idea is inherently politicized, right? Or political, right? But it also manifests in the way that diasporas, again, buy into, as I noted, the upward mobility, the fantasy of the American dream. When Islamophobia is institutionalized in U.S. domestic as well as foreign policy, the U.S. has secret black sites exclusively for Muslims, not for Jews. The FBI regularly surveils mosques, not synagogues. State legislators often target this ambiguous Sharia law, although there's no monolithic Sharia law, right? Sharia really signifies all the Islamic adjudications or fiqh or jurisprudence that has been collected over 1,400 years, and there's no unanimity over that. It's just a collection of adjudications. But nonetheless, it's Sharia law that's targeted and banned, not Talmudic law, right? When we talk about foreign policy, insofar as Muslims from Muslim majority countries being subject to bans, right? Or immigration bans. The government funds counter-extremism programs that target explicitly Muslims. Muslims' homes tend to be raided by FBI, for acts of free speech that are couched in concerns for terrorism, hate crimes against Muslims that require a much higher bar for believability, right? That anti-Jewish crimes, and this is not to say that anti-Jewish crimes, are not worthy of obviously contending with, right? So this becomes the problem, right? The way that anti-Muslim racism, the way that Islamophobia is weaponized to police, to surveil, to criminalize Islam, Muslims, and by extension, of course, Arabs and Palestinians. So this is what is meant by strategy and tactic, right? This is what is meant when we are talking about our children and demands for divestment, when my words are taken out of context, because I'm trying to also situate the fact that there is a hypocrisy that is playing out within diasporas. Insofar as we're arguing for land back Palestine, a free Palestine, well, what about our complicities here in terms of settler colonialism as diasporas, as Arabs, as Muslims, as South Asians, as Africans, that choose on some level a degree of agency, right, in terms of migration? And that doesn't mean that we enjoy the same privileges as the white settler, but that doesn't mean that we're not complicit either, right? And what does it mean in the context of Columbia, an Ivy League school with assets within Lockheed Martin, HEICO, BlackRock, Google, Microsoft? What are we actually after then? A politics of assimilation, or to transcend, as these encampments embodied, a new imaginary horizon that engages both demands for justice, but also refusal of the dominant order that exists, that involves processes of rebirth, of, again, a pluriverse world of communing, of engaging in mutual aid, of mutual decision-making, of enacting sort of, again, solidarity as a verb, of autonomy, of thinking through collective liberation, of prioritizing life, new worlds, as opposed to how they become pathologized, right? But this is what we're confronting, really, is a pushback. As Martin Luther King told us, it's the white moderates that are ultimately more devoted to order than to justice, right? They prefer a negative kind of peace, which is absence of any kind of like tension, to a positive space, which prefers the presence of justice, right? Defense must never lead to public disorder. Well, about the structural violence in terms of the violence that's used to produce the law, to conserve the law, settler laws, let alone to enact the white man's laws, right? And yet we see discourses as, counter-protesters, right? Where they're actually ex-duty, ex-police officers, pro-genocide zealots and Zionists, state-sanctioned and condoned right-wing terrorists. Right. So this is the reactionary inception that pits people's communities across the board, whether it's within the Muqawma, which literally stands for resistance, not liberation, right? As well as other factions on the ground.
Yeah, when we're thinking about this question of strategy and tactics, it's widespread in movements all around, and the Palestinian movement isn't unique in this, in that armed resistance is one tactic, the use of legal avenues is another tactic, a discursive strategy in media is another tactic. So we talk a lot about tactics, and with questions of, for example, international law, that has been something that has been very straining in the Palestinian resistance movement since its inception, because international law is what created the problem in the first place, the United Nations partitioning Palestine. And so then the question has been how to use international law then, but to not be used by it, right? And so then we've been talking about, over the last decade or more and more conversations about law as tactic, and if we think about armed resistance as tactic, and if we think about a media discursive strategy as tactic, we need to have a strategy that guides it. That's the difference between the two. Strategy is that longer term plan, and the tactic is just the tool, the method that you use to advance that plan and disengage if it's weakening that plan, if it's weakening that strategy, right? And the thing is that we usually don't see strategies outside of empire, outside of trying to be part of that world of the above when we're being crushed below, right? Trying to go up, just trying to survive, surviving rather than thriving. And so when we don't have strategies outside of empire, then the strategy is going to be empire. It is going to be authoritarianism, the continued destruction of life. It's going to be capitalism. It's going to be the dominant world. That same logic and practice of 1492 globally, that's of course existed well before 1492 in many other parts of the world. It's just become so intense and global since 1492 that it has become the battle that many of us all over the globe are fighting as a primary front. And that is so important in thinking about then Palestine and resistance versus liberation. And thank you for making that distinction. So if we're positioned above, and our tactic, right, is to use law or to use armed resistance or whatever our tactic is in order to be free, then we need to have a liberation project that is truly a liberation project and not an assimilationist project into the world of the dog-eat-dog world, of the world that believes that human beings since the beginning of time have always been fighting, and that's just our destiny. We know from many other worlds all over planet Earth that doesn't have to be that way. It can be other ways, and so when we talk about then resistance from the below to being crushed from by the above, yes, I support the resistance of the below to continue living to resist their own annihilation, no matter who they are. And that's why context is so important. There isn't one identity that is always eternally going to be the oppressed and eternally going to be the oppressor. Like when we talk about the white man, and that's something that we need to tease out more, because people believe that we're talking about people with light skin rather than a structural position of power. Right. And this is something that Malcolm X in his final year, where he was really theorizing so many contradictions he was trying to get at that he hadn't been allowed under the Nation of Islam. When he left the Nation of Islam, he was traveled to Africa and Mecca. He was able to see that there is a distinction between being white adjective, or just incidentally white, just as a descriptor of how one looks, versus acting like one is the boss because they have lighter colored skin. And that's the context that the United States was built from. And of course, not just the United States, has become so global. Anti-Blackness has become so global as capitalism has globalized, as 1492 has globalized as well. So when we're looking then at this question of 1492, it allows us to think of a strategy outside of empire. If we're starting with the map, and this is a problem inherent to all area studies all over the university, area studies in the university only look at the areas that they're looking at. So Middle East studies, for example, doesn't look at Latin American studies. You know, they don't really talk to each other. Palestine studies looks mostly at Palestine, you know, and maybe the region sometimes, but definitely it's very lacking in terms of a global and a deeper historical analysis, which is why I think that your work is so important. And that's why it's so important for us to keep talking about and try to figure out what is a liberation movement, not just a resistance movement, not just resistance to our own annihilation, but what is a movement that can create a world where many worlds fit. And again, your work is so key in this question of Palestine because Islam is very important in the question of Palestine. Al-Aqsa is extremely important. And this is something that gets secularized a lot. The Palestinian struggle gets secularized in the West, likely because audiences don't want to talk about Islam, or they have a hard time with Islam, and maybe just not a lot of people know how to talk about liberation when it comes to theology, even though there's such a rich history on that. And I'd like to hear from you how this has affected your work in academia, because I know that there is, just by the nature of the way that it's set up, and I confronted this being someone who was doing a global analysis on Palestine and other resistance movements, that there wasn't very much a desire to really question the whole thing, which for a lot of us is very necessary, because as we're trying to figure out what brings us together and struggle all over the world, we need to keep going down to the root that we share in that history and in that geography. And I also want to point out that although the movement gets secularized a lot in the West, by many on the left, they fall into a binary where, for example, if Iran, if Bashar al-Assad, if Putin, if anybody is critical of Western imperialism, then they become the good guys, or they become someone that we're not allowed to critique. And a lot of that does come from not wanting to contribute to an imperialist overthrow of any of those regimes, has been the case. So I want to, on that point, I want to ask you about the sentence after the one that keeps getting cited about, you know, with the resistance, but up to a point. Your next sentence, which is so important for us to really talk about if we're really going to tackle all the contradictions, because we really want to figure this out. Quote, "How do we stand in solidarity with women in Iran refusing the hijabs while being critical of a neoconservative cis-hetero Islam, the mullahs, and at the same time adopting an anti-imperialist interventionist stance that counters attempt to divide Iran, as Iraq before it, along sectarian and ethnic lines?"
Thank you, Yakiki. Really, it's a question that but has certainly plagued my mind since Tahrir Square, and what happened in 2011 versus what happened in 2013, because what happened in 2013 could have happened in 2011. What I mean by that is that people were united vis-a-vis shi'arat, or slogans, in 2011, red freedom, social justice. Be it the Muslim Brotherhood, be it, you know, Copts, be it leftists, feminists, queers, Nasrites, Sadatists. And the question of what Kwame Ture had referred to as mobilization organization, of course, I'm going to return back to the difference between mobilization and organization, because we can and should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. In 2013, it was the leftists, the feminists, queers, and anarchists and Marxists that called for the slaughter of the Muslim Brotherhood in the two sit-ins of Araban. And that is because they did not want to contend with the spiritual dimension, because they've only been exposed to conservative interpretations, authoritarian interpretations of Islam. I get it. But then where is the example of Malcolm? Where's the example of Martin Luther King? Where's the example of Ali Shariati, Nat Turner, and so many different others? I mean, again, there's a legacy, and sort of we could sit down and talk about sort of spiritual leftist traditions, of which many exist, right? But the question of mobilization versus organization, because right now what we see is, well, conservative Muslims right next to queer Muslims, and conservative Muslims are against CRT. They don't think that anti-blackness is necessarily an issue. They are against, feminism, queerness, etc. Right next to queer Muslims in these protests, right next to anti-Zionist Jews, right next to Islamophobic and anti-spiritual left, and everybody's yelling "Free, free Palestine, globalize the Intifada," without them speaking about, well, what vision of a free Palestine does that ostensibly mean, let alone what does it mean in relationship to Turtle Island, which is also stolen land. But as Kwame Ture had noted, organization is about understanding structures, the structure that we're in, settler colonialism. The question then becomes, as you noted, Bashar al-Assad, as I've always referred to him, is the butcher of Damascus, Safah Damashq. Okay, if you ask me now versus in 2013, 2014, remove him, etc., etc. But if you ask me now, I say, please keep him in power. This is not out of love for Bashar al-Assad. This is out of the fact of the reality that given Daesh, given a lot of things, including American imperialism, Daesh being ISIS, and so on and so forth, and the imperialist plan to divide and conquer and destroy Syria or partition it into 3 different territories, the same thing with regards to Iran, and so on and so forth. Well, I'm not interested in that imperialist venture anyways. So I always say, until then we know what the alternatives are going to be in terms of liberation and a plan, a strategy. Then please, let's avoid more of a mess, because look at what happened in Libya. Look at what's happening in Sudan. Look at what's happening in so many different places in Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. So that becomes the question. There is no going back to 1492. The very geography and land has changed. I'm not looking to go back to the time of Muhammad. I'm looking to extract the ethical, political, spiritual commitments that informed Isa's message. The Isa that stood and defended Mary Magdalene. Musa, who stood before Pharaoh. Muhammad, who stood before social justice or for social justice, and so on and so forth. And you're right, because it's not a matter of the white man. Whiteness is not a phenotype. It's not a color of skin. When people of color have internalized a degree of resentment that we bleach our skin white. People of color have internalized cultures of whiteness. Our black, red, brown-skinned folks with white masks. Eric Adams is an example. There are many examples that exist nowadays that buy into the hyphenated, again, progressive sort of narrative that look at me, I'm an example of the American dream, despite the fact that you're a composite and parcel and part of the machina of the settler colonial order. But revolutions then involve practical questions. What are you going to do with a nuclear power plant? What are you going to do with the police? What are you going to do when somebody gets sick? What are you going to do insofar as food? We talk about the fall of capitalism, yet most people of color who live in the, or become urbanized or live in the urban metropolis based upon, of course, relocation, choice, etc., don't even know how to grow our own food. We become disconnected from the umbilical cord, our Mother Earth, that is the land that produces the air that we breathe, the very thamarat, or food, the seed that sprouts into vegetables and fruits that we consume, that we need for our own survival, let alone thriving. Ostensibly, but who controls the I-4 Rust Belt corridor? It's the white man that is armed to the teeth with stamp decrees and feeds the metropolis. So whiteness is more than a color of skin. We've internalized all cultures of whiteness, and this becomes the question, right? Of the question of building alternatives, and this then becomes the ability to walk and chew gum at the same time. The effervescing of tahrir. Then occupy, which is problematic within itself, as you know, because, what are you occupying when it's stolen land? No Dakota. The Black Spring, as if we don't have Trayvon Martin's, Michael Brown, Sandra Bland's, Breonna Taylor's. Anti-Blackness still continues. So where did the Black Spring lead us? And the co-optation of that, and the co-optation of movements, because there isn't enough organizing, because we're invested in tactics and not strategies. Right. And now we somehow have moved into Palestine. What connects all these struggles? Then we go back to the original point, right, of 1492 and what it has to embody of what people buy into in terms of a secular ethos, because they don't want to confront the dimension of spirituality, of its role. How can you connect with our beloved Mother Earth, again, who is a spiritual subject, not an object? How can you love without spirit? How can you love without spirit? These become the questions, right? Subscribing to a politics of fear, the boogeyman that is Islam, or contending with it, the continuation of Malcolm's project, the Quran of the oppressed. And that's what I tried to do. But this is the terrain and ground that unfortunately is being ceded. The reason that my work is being gatekept, and one can argue that Marxists don't like it, as you know, and we've discussed it before, because it's dealing with anarchism. Anarchists don't like it because it's spiritual. And so on and so forth. Queer Muslims and Muslim feminists in so many different circles and respects, because I'm calling them out on their complicity over queer narratives, or colonialism, and one could go on, because I'm talking about transnational notions of indigeneity, right? Because I'm talking about the intersections of Islam and blackness. We're able. And again, maybe to address then this dimension, and to go back to this point, this is why the encampments became so important, Kiki. And you and I realize this because we felt it. We've been there, and we were there, and we've seen our children. Because what they created, as I said yesterday in a conversation with Rodney DJ Kelly for JVP Los Angeles, what they created is what Kwame had noted, Walter Rodney, guerrilla intellectual, Walter Rodney, in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, a total way of life, a spiritual and cultural way of life. They had embodied a different way of eating, of wearing, of dressing, of walking, of talking, of mannerisms, in the way that they discussed engaged death, shahada, martyrdom, in the way that they appreciated newborns and life, because we had children within these encampments, families within these encampments. And they came in with the perspective, as Kwame Ture had noted, of the knowledge I have now is not the knowledge that I had when I entered into these encampments. And so in so many ways, they were embodying a revolutionary spirit that was not based on destruction, that was based on creation. And that is the beauty. That is being dismissed, unfortunately, right? And how the characterization, the assassinations, or the attempts, the depictions of these encampments are and continue to be. That's the promise that our children bring in terms of a new imaginary. That, again, I always love this quote by Naumia, because he talks about our children. Well, I always say our youth teach us how to dream dangerously. And as adults, we grow inculcated in fear, in despotism, in careerism, in institutionalized everything. The horizons of our imaginations become hindered. We reconstruct this carcerality physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, right? Because we have something to lose, the sense of insecurity that we've internalized. But our youth, there's no horizon to their dreams. And that is precisely their beauty, the inspiration, the galvanizing of everybody, of the entirety of not just academics, but entire segments of society, right? And how they're putting their bodies, their souls, their lives that haven't really even started on the line, their families, their names. And what then becomes of our responsibility towards them, the older generation, the more secure generation? That becomes the question, insofar as, again, collective liberation, given the political theaters of Congress, these are kids that are being attacked by chemical weapons, for God's sake, and exposed to terrorist acts, right? But their audacity, their courage leaves me bereft. But I'll stop there. There's a lot that one can say about these encampments, and
feeling in the encampments, and it's something that is so difficult to talk about. I've been giving a lot of teach-ins in the encampments, and they all want to know about Chiapas and Palestine and South and Palestine. And it's something that is so surreal, because I've given this talk many times before, and it kind of leaves this question for people, like, could it be real? But it's something that, I can describe it as much as I want. Like when I go to Zapatista territory, it feels different. You just feel loved. It's a very different circulation of power. You feel taken care of, you feel safe, or at least a lot of us who go. And in the encampments, that's what people are feeling. There was a student at the Cal State LA encampment the other night, who said it plainly, like, it feels like this is the sane space in my life. When I leave it, the world is nuts out there. The world just keeps on living, being okay with genocide. That's not okay. So what the students have done, it's so remarkable precisely because it's prefiguring that world that we need now in terms of how we're going to not just struggle, but also be free. This question of how we're going to make agreements and have disagreements. This is the heart of this question of the distinction between mobilizing and organizing. There's a lot of conversations, discussions, debates that have to take place when you're holding a space like that. But what brings you together is that you're fighting for your lives. There's a real threat, and things that maybe have been theory before, or something that we saw from the outside, like how Israel trains the police here, everyone is seeing it. At UCLA, for example, and not just at UCLA, but very famously the fight with the Zionist thugs, with LAPD just watching, kind of like, enjoying the show. This is how paramilitaries function all over the world. The police don't want to make it known that it's the state doing it, so they support paramilitaries. And because that encampment held against the paramilitaries, against the Zionist thugs, that's when LAPD, and not just LAPD, California Highway Patrol and the Sheriff's Department, Google LASD gangs, Los Angeles Sheriff's Department gangs, find out about them. They all came together, and they had to do it in their own name. The students forced the mask to come off, just like how Palestinians have been forcing the mask to come off of empire for generations. So these masks are coming off. And so the questions that we have then is, how do we then live now that we know that the world is this way? And how complicated it is too, because there's so many of our loved ones who are still indoctrinated or don't want to know the truth. Something that brings so many of the encampments together is truth seeking. That type of detective work, right? Like what actually is going on. And it's become Palestine is now become such a focal point for anyone really trying to talk about reality, what's actually happening in the world. Finally, there's a space where students can have these conversations that their own professors are being policed against having, and some of their professors don't even want to touch it, and now they're forcing it. Well, we're going to have these conversations whether you like it or not. And not only that, they're seeing the difference between education and indoctrination. They're creating their own education. Now they're seeing that at the Ivy League, the students are being indoctrinated, probably more so in a lot of ways at those levels, because that's the ruling class. And the ruling class, the above, right, needs to play nice with the rules of the above. And what's happening is that those set up to be above are rejecting that. They're coming down with the below. They're like, I don't care if I graduate. Perspective, please, there's a genocide in Gaza. That's coming down with the below, and that's finding that more ethical, political common, if we might call it that common. And what it's doing for the anti-capitalist struggles all over the world, and especially here, is raising a lot of consciousness as to why we don't, in this society, why it doesn't matter when that you're, how you got your money if you're rich. Traditionally, all that's mattered is that you're rich, and nobody asks how you got rich, and the students are exposing how the university is making its money, and that's not right. And so it's demanding an ethics for how it is that the economy even functions in the way that it does. I wanted to ask you, because I know that you taught your last classes in the encampment, and I wanted to know, just give you space to share what that was like at the Columbia encampment before it got taken down.
Thank you. These youth are my heart and my soul. They are my backbone. They are my spine. They are the whip of the tongue by which I derive strength to speak truth to power. Amidst the loneliness, the harshness, the isolation, admittedly, that I have been confronting this past while, it is they that breathed life into me. every morning, regardless of the tears, the moment that I could see or stepped onto campus and can begin to see the encampment, I felt alive, that I wasn't just walking dead. The moment that I left, when I left, if I left, I felt my heart being ripped away from my chest, and I couldn't wait to get back the next day. And I merely went back to my studio to shower and rest. The fact that they would create, again, a common, an imaginary horizon in which food, in which shelter, in which a certain kind of disordered order manifested, right? Because they had codes, they had ethical political commitments, they had spiritual commitments, they had commitments in the fact that they rejected trash and they picked up their own trash. They respected Mother Earth. The fact that they had a public library, they had a food station, they had a medic station. It was a new form of code of conduct. They did have rules against harassment, prohibitions of littering, of drugs, of alcohol. I felt like I was literally within the caracoles back with the Zapatistas, because those are precisely sort of part of the women's revolutionary laws, right? It was extremely calm. It was festive, you know, and I miss that. Now the NYPD is on campus, the militarized zone that it has become. Students are forbidden from going to campus unless they live in residence. And faculty were forbidden up until a few days ago. And I cannot bear staring at the west or the east lawn. I have not even tried to go through the main campus, the Morningside campus. Holding my class there there was more learning done at the encampment than sitting in a prison cell at the basement of a building, because we submitted one another to not for somebody to educate us, but for us to hold each other's hands and learn from one another. Because half the encampment would show up to class, and regardless of the fact of whether they'd done the readings or not, they'd be enthralled upon the conversation, and they would ask questions, incredibly intelligent and astute questions, and they would sit down and read and engage and have side discussions and conversations. This is what that beauty birthed, you know. George Jackson, our martyr, you know, it said, "It follows that if a thing is not a building, it is certainly decaying, that life is revolution. That life is revolution, and that the world will die if we do not read and act out its imperatives." And they embodied that reading, that active act of imperatives, the decision-making, the consensus that they had built. They had brought life back to words, to meanings. You know, this is a men's situation too, Kiki, in which, as you know, I'm sure at UCLA, you know, Proud Boys, Mike Johnson, Speaker Johnson, came to speak. Of course, celebrity activists came to speak, to do their photo op thing, and students were quite aware of how they're being manipulated and used. And again, they were very organic in the way that they contended with these, but white supremacists at the gates trying to scale it, yelling, "Go back to Gaza," calling the students monkeys. And then we have, of course, you know, as I noted yesterday, you know, Eric Adams, right? You know, this Baron Minoucheism, sort of from the Wizard of Oz, this Pinocchio, he wants to go live back in Israel at the Golan Heights. He's not aware that, you know, the Golan Heights are part of Syria, right? In a certain sense, calling them outside agitators, right? Which is a racist concept within itself because of how it was being deployed against civil rights activists, right? I miss my kids. I miss our kids a lot. And, you know, now it's just sitting in my office, and it's hard because I know that they're isolated. Jail support work. And you know, taking to the streets isn't going to do it, because doing an encampment is an assertion of a certain authority. And I wish, faculty could engage in their own encampments, particularly those that are in secure positions. I think that would signal something to our youth, to our children, of support, particularly at a time in which they are not allowed. Their own safety, which is forbidden to them, by NYPD officers that engage even in sexual harassment. So there's nothing like the unsafe space that the wards of the state, the settler state, let alone, clearly a settler institution that has been, this is the strong arm of the state, has been co-opted into, right? But we need to reinvigorate. We need to be with our kids. Because they're still full of hope, they're still full of uncompromising values and commitments. And we need to think about how we can have mobile encampments, how we can bring in community assemblies within our neighborhoods. The gentrified sort of Harlem territory that Columbia is complicit in, Manhattanville, to mobilize, to organize ourselves on our streets, so that the students don't feel that they're just in this alone and they're the ones that are having to explicitly sacrifice. And again, their audacity, hearing from my kids that, hijabi women that had their hijabs stripped from them in jail, in prison. The non-hijabi kids were, screaming back at the police officers, right? Give her back her hijab, the degree of dignity and respect that they had to stand up for one another. In encampments in which Muslims, Jews, Christians prayed together, taught one another, and one can go on and on. The discussions on Kashmir, on Hindu Tava, on oppressions migrate all over the world, right? And really in nuanced ways. So yeah, at this moment, admittedly, I feel rather heartbroken and rather constrained in terms of what I can do, but inshallah, we need to put everything that we have on the line for them, as they have expended everything too.
Facts. This question of faculty, I've seen more faculty find more courage with the student encampments and in defending the students from the police, from the admin. And it's maybe for them too, maybe for so many, this has been a true mask-off moment for the university, where it's even questionable how the university is going to be able to survive this without being openly fascist, like with Columbia having NYPD there all the way through commencement, which was just canceled at Columbia, which means it was never about commencement in the first place. A lot of what we're seeing is this autonomous building of other worlds, with education being a big one, and with medical help, with just being with food. Food is the centerpiece of a lot of the encampments, and just that mutual aid. So much of the mutual aid that has been built in communities on the street is being seen in the encampments too. It's something that is it's kind of laughable when we hear these politicians talking about there being a mastermind behind this, like whether it's a professor or outside agitators, as if the community and the university aren't supposed to be together. Like, a lot of students are community members, a lot of students are organizers. There isn't a neat line between them. And what we're seeing, and I would love to get your insights on this for others to hear too, because what I feel like what we're seeing is how I felt when I first saw Tahrir Square and it was on Al Jazeera on television. I was living in Palestine at that moment, watching Bethlehem. Egyptians taking Tahrir Square, not just taking it from the police, but holding on to it, which then meant, how is everybody going to eat? How is everybody going to eat? Where's the waste going to go? What are we going to do with this space? And then hearing for just even those few days how it was quite magical in that there wasn't sexual harassment in the encampment in Tahrir Square, like there is generally in Cairo, on the streets of Cairo, for women, for example. And for me, you know, and it's of course devastating knowing like what would happen next in terms of its destruction. But I am curious if you might share what are some similarities that you saw between Tahrir Square and the encampments, because there is a line that we can trace from Tahrir Square to Occupy and to the encampments and the other mutual aid work. And I wonder what you think about the future of the encampments that is hopeful and maybe something that would worry you that we should all keep an eye out for. And I think about this question of co-optation, for example, that we see a lot in movements. So just to give you an opportunity to share with us, what was it like in Tahrir Square that's similar and different from this moment? And what are some lessons of Tahrir Square that we need to pay attention to in this moment for the struggles here?
Thank you for your question, Ikiki, and just this engagement and this conversation. I'm very grateful for you. I think similarities include the fact that in the case of Egypt, for the first time, people were taking responsibility for land, for public space that was always theirs to contend with. Certainly the organizing of food, of shelter, medical stations, tents. That is something that is very similar. Women were manning checkpoints at Tahrir Square, right? Was there incidents of sexual harassment? Absolutely, but then communities had to contend with that. The space had to contend with that, and that's okay because we learn as we walk with the land, not on her, but with the land. She teaches us a lot of things if we actually listen. This is the beauty about Palestine, is that she has much to teach us of wisdom. If we really listen and not confine ideologically our representation of what a free Palestine actually means, or presuppose or pre-impose that. But hence the entrapment that happened in Tahrir, that we presupposed from, or a lot did, from ideological positions. And what a liberated Tahrir might actually mean. We didn't embody the spirit of Tahrir. Again, revolutions involved changing the way that we eat, the way that we breathe, the way that we conceive of intimacy. So we didn't take that lesson. We didn't engage in the revolutionary becoming. We didn't engage in the greater jihad, the jihad against the self, the fascisms of the self. We didn't learn to listen to one another. We dismissed the role of spirituality. And we didn't engage in the same public discursive learning that we needed to do, or that these encampments embodied. Because, again, perhaps it's the poverty, the lack of education that existed and exists and is exploding within Egypt. We're talking about the context of students here, that, you know, at least a lot of my kids that are engaged with queer, with indigenous, with Black, with African, with feminist, with a lot of different discourses simultaneously, right? Tahrir became very easily co-opted because you had the upper middle class youth, English-speaking youth, that really had no or very little organizing experience, if we're being blunt and honest, that came from prominent political backgrounds. And that was sort of the cachet blanche of what it is that facilitated that their rise, and social media capital that exploded at that particular juncture in terms of their platforming at the expense of many others. So when I brought up questions of abolition, when I brought up questions of our relationship with land, when I brought up queer issues, prominent activists would reject all these different dimensions and say, well, you know, and excuse me, but this was actually something that was said to me by a prominent activist, that and I'm using the Egyptian dialect here, oh, do you want a revolution for fags? That's literally the term that he used, right? And somebody who's revered and had on a pedestal. And it's quite sad because this brother, this kin of mine, this sibling of mine is now in prison. But then what did we all fight? What did we all sacrifice? What you know, the bodies that we fished out of the Nile, and there were many, were that the youth that we saw murdered and killed before our very eyes. from all walks of life, be it Coptic, be it Muslim, be it atheist, be it whatnot. That becomes the question. These encampments here, though, they're much open to walking with the land and allowing the land, our mother, to speak to us. And that is their beauty, their hunger, their thirst, because, and perhaps what facilitates that is precisely their space and what the space signifies in terms of manifestation. Let us sit down and talk. Let us sit down and learn. They embodied what the Zapatistas had noted, and you heard me say this many a times, that nobody can plan revolutions, but rather we hold each other's hands and we ask what each of us knows. They embodied humility, modesty, care, affection, warmth, in the midst of immense conditions of strife, of attempts at co-optation by politicians, by celebrity activists who would walk in, give a bunch of speeches, take a bunch of photos with their entourages, then tweet. Because they embodied what the left generally lacks in terms of an ethics of conflict resolution and disagreements. Because they had developed between them, Yakiki, a politics of hospitality and friendship. And this is what we need to highlight is, look, I didn't just know our youth, these kids, our student, over the course of 3 weeks. I've been with them since I arrived in January. And I made sure to meet them. That was my priority. I knew exactly why I was coming here. I was coming here to certainly educate, but to also learn, because I'm part of what needs unsettling. I'm part of what needs to learn. I'm not here to indoctrinate. These are not infantilized children. These are youth that have their own minds that, again, have access to truths, realities of the world that have been unmasked, that have been exposed before their very eyes, and all the false binary choices. And they're yearning and they're searching and they're thirsty for answers. Like a Bedouin that have crossed, deserts everlast, right? Pangeas. And that is what they manifested. They didn't presume, again, answers. They're not ideologically constrained. They don't need me. And I told them, actually, in my last class at the encampment, I told them it was very hard because, knowing it was the last class, but I purposely would sort of leave the class because some of my students, they were running their projects and giving their talks or whatnot. And usually they are the teachers. When they're in that role, the last half of the semester, they were the teachers. So they'd run the class. But the last class, purposely, I would actually just leave, be outside on the perimeter or the border of the encampment, and then I would go back. Partly because it was really hard to know that this is the last class and not knowing when I might teach again, leaving them as I am in my 30th and the US because of the visa, but also partly because I wanted them to truly believe. I've taught them everything that I know. I've shared with them everything. Now it's for them to decide. And again, without some righteous equivocation on my end as to the choices that they are to make. We all make choices. But hopefully those choices will not be based on surviving, but rather thriving, and they will continue to embody the spirit. And I'm confident that they will. I can't unsee our kids being arrested. I can't forget their faces, their smiles, their voices, even if I tried. And I'm deeply, deeply, profoundly grateful for them and what they have taught me and continue to teach me for every iota of a moment that I had to spend with them. So yeah, as much as Tahrir was seductive, was beautiful, I think these students managed to capture something more, and maybe perhaps it's the smallness of these encampments. The question, as you and I have talked, is how do we organize these encampments beyond in a network space that preserves their solidarity without a form of solidity, if you will? How do we expand them? How do we grow them and grow their spirits and what they seek to nourish?
Yeah, those conversations are being had already by so many organizers who've been doing this for a while, and students themselves realizing, for example, saying, as we learn more, now we understand what these sweeps are against the 10 cities of unhoused people And as they are in the struggle, for example, how Columbia students who were arrested were charged with misdemeanors, and the CUNY students were charged with felonies. Like seeing that big discrepancy in the way that the world works, there's so much learning and exposing that's taking place from this struggle. And when I think about then what the future is for education, in particular in the university, under this new McCarthyism, there are already there's already conversations and organizing taking place for doing education in a different way, for linking up with Palestinians in Gaza, for example, where there are no universities left, and having like a global university for Gaza, where it's all volunteer, and which is the same spirit as the encampments, as Tahrir, as the struggles that are struggles for care and for love, as medicine against struggles of fear, which is the foundation for fascism, for the foundation for seeking a politics, a way of relating to others where you're always scared of them, and so want to keep climbing up above, and keep crushing them. This is what we see with the Zionist project. It's not a liberation movement. The question of Jewish liberation is still very much alive, and it's not Israel. Israel is a project among many things, but one is to make it so that Jews who from Europe, who they believe to be the quote unquote correct human material, as they have said, that they be above, and then they don't care who is below. Palestinians have had to be that below. So much of the world has had to be that below so that this project, that is the state of Israel, could exist. This fear inculcated even today more and more to our Jewish relatives, that there's no safe place for them to live. This is coming from their own oppressors. This is coming from those who've kicked them out of Europe and who've not wanted them to live in Europe alongside them, side by side. So what we're seeing is this moment where that entire order is being questioned, and it's so important because this is, I think, what a lot of us mean about Palestine. Free Palestine will help us free the world, because to get to Palestine, we have to question the whole thing, and with Palestinians, the beautiful thing that I have experienced accompanying Palestinians and their struggle is how much they are led by the heart. So many Palestinians I know are led by the heart and genuinely trying to not repeat what has happened to them onto others, and really trying to find another way. And there's all kinds of different ideas and proposals. Of course, where we all come together is on the right to resist. Absolutely. You have the right to resist your own annihilation. I don't care who you are. Like that's the point, is that's where we begin. In terms of other questions of how we share the world together with all our different, Palestinians need to be alive. We all need to be alive to be able to have those conversations. Those are those key conversations. And so I just want to, now that we have just a couple minutes left, Mohamed, and thank you so much for this conversation. I am so happy that we can have this publicly, like when you and I talk, it's always like this, and I always wish that we could have more compas around and eventually weave together and hear what everyone has to say, because these questions are trying to really get at the root. That's what we mean by radical, going down to the root. That's what that means. So I'd like to give you these last few minutes just on any final thoughts or words, or ways that maybe we could support you, that we can continue supporting the students at Columbia, and of course throughout the rest of the world in these encampments.
Thank you. I recall, and the verse in the Quran that was never really quoted as a verse in the Quran, and some of the allegations that were leveled against me in these Zionist hit pieces that says that وَكَمْ مِنْ فِئَةٍ قَلِيلَةٍ غَلَبَتْ فِئَةً كَبِيرَةً. How much of a small group defeated a larger enemy? But the Quran also says وَعِدُّوا لَهُمْ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُم مِّن قُوَّةٍ, and prepare for them what is necessary in terms of strength. It's a David and Goliath. The Panthers were not large in numbers, yet they created breakfast programs, schools, alternative ways. Mistakes as any movement is susceptible to. hierarchies, vanguardism, queerphobia, etc. The Zapatistas pushed the emblem of the Panthers further. And the great inspirational movement that they were, continue to be, may ancestors and creator protect them in this difficult hour, given the limitations of sort of state socialism, let's just put it that way, given Obrador and the incursions on the Zapatistas that are very much unfolding and have been unfolding for the past 6 months almost as well. I would say heart and spirit, prayer and thought. Let us genuinely listen to Palestine, but also in relationship to Turtle Island. Let us face the monsters within, but also that exist in the mirror in terms of the very structure that we are all entangled within here. Let us learn to build alternative worlds, to imagine and embody these worlds beyond the academy. The academy has been critiqued endlessly for decades. DEI and all that entails of US imperialist soft power and settler colonial power. The question that becomes, and is a question of violence, because there is no decolonization without violence. And these kids, again, our youth are contending with the fact that they're also not only dealing with external violence, but also the violence of having to undo themselves, of unsettling themselves, their identities, who they are. This is their bravery. This is precisely their bravery, because they're looking at the mirror. They're not looking away. They're looking straight at it and contending with a very tumultuous and difficult questions. I had the opportunity to visit the encampment in Wesleyan. It grew from 20 to 30 to 100 tents. Education is key. Learning is key, more so than education. Nouns have to become verbs. So far as my support, to conclude, I think there's a petition going around, interviews that I've done with the Electronic Intifada, with Jadaliya, that I'm humbled, as well as the Red Nation, as forums to perhaps extrapolate what happened specifically with me and further discussions with regards to the encampment. And hopefully more opportunities with you, Kiki, given the symbiotic sort of relationship that we also have in terms of our commitments and our visions and our dreams, mutually intertwined dreams. I ask nothing. Alhamdulillah, I've lived a great life. I've been blessed with many things, experiences beyond what I imagined. Black Panther, a former member of the Black Liberation Army, as an elder, Ashanti Alston, to live 2 uprisings, Tahrir, to indigenous land defending of the Zapatistas. I've lived a delirious dream of a world. As the Zapatistas say, then nothing for us, everything for everybody. What I fear and what I want most from our audience is to support our youth. Our children are what come from immortality. They are the arrows that we shoot towards infinity. They are the promise. They are the future. They genuinely are. And we cannot allow this to be another passing by moment. The time for change now is now. We need to make the stand now. We need to end this genocide now. We need to connect, and it doesn't take much, these encampments together vis-a-vis projectors, and we did that in our encampment. And white screens or white sheets to bring in Bisan, to bring in the voices of people from Gaza. And I know other encampments, as you know, that are doing the same. But we need to decide what our strategy and what we're fighting against, as I said from the beginning, and what we're fighting for. Both are important. Who are we fighting? Are we just fighting capitalism? Or are we fighting the state? And what are we then fighting for? And what are responsibilities in that fight? The individual responsibilities, the collective responsibilities that we have towards one another and to our Mother Earth. That is what becomes the question. Please remember the Columbia, the CUNY, our loved ones, our beating hearts in your thoughts and your prayers, those in UCLA, those in Gaza, those in Rafah, our children that are in Rafah, by the hundreds of thousands that are there and under siege and under incursion. But we need to think about our positioning here And what we're doing here, in retrospect to being in the very belly of the beast, the very heart of the serpent snake, as Frederick Douglass would refer to her, this fantasy of America and its genocidal ongoing past, present, its suicidal, its homicidal present, as well as its suicidal future. We need to relearn how to dream dangerously again. We can only do that when we are together, and we have to do it that face to face, and we have to do that on the land. It can't be done over signal groups. It can't be done over Twitter and social media. We have to live it. We have to embody it. We have to breathe it. We have to feel it. We have to be transformed by it. Thank you, and thank again Haymarket and Sean, but I'm indebted to you, Kiki, because you were the one that initiated this. So I'm indebted to you, my sister, for your love, for your support. You are a part of my heart as these kids are, and I can't live without my heart.
Likewise, compa. Likewise. Everyone, please pick up Mohamed Abdou's book, Islam and Anarchism. Let's continue having these conversations that seem so difficult. And the hardest one is the internal one, like you're saying, Mohammed, seeing ourselves in the mirror as the possible monsters that we fear. And doing it together is necessary in a space where it's okay for us to be vulnerable and to make mistakes, because we're building, not destroying. So thank you. Thank you, Haymarket. Thank you, Mohammed. And we'll leave it with free Palestine, free Turtle Island, free Africa, free the land.
Assalamu alaikum.